The smell of cured concrete always carried a specific kind of dust, even over the heavy scent of chlorine and sea salt. It was 2 in the afternoon on the sunny California coast, the kind of blinding, shadowless daylight that exposed every flaw in a structure. I stood at the edge of the infinity pool, my heavy gray work t-shirt sticking to my shoulders, staring down at a microfracture in the basin. It wasn't just a simple surface crack. The fissure ran jaggedly down the plaster, disappearing into the deep end, and it was weeping. A steady, barely perceptible bleed of groundwater was pushing its way inward, a symptom of a massive retaining wall failure waiting to happen. The hydrostatic pressure from the hillside above was slowly crushing the shell of the pool. The water rippled, breaking the glare of the sun. I looked up from my clipboard, my thumb resting heavily over the steel clip. She waded toward the shallow end, chest deep in the crystalline water. Olivia. I'd been hired strictly as a high-end aquatics engineer to assess the damage, but looking at her, the geometry in my head temporarily stalled. She had blonde hair plastered to the nape of her neck, wet and completely unstyled. She wore thick, black-rimmed glasses that were splattered with droplets of water and a simple, utilitarian gray swimsuit that clung to her. She stepped up onto the top submerged step, the water sheeting off her shoulders. There was no corporate armor today, no blazer, no phone tightly gripped in her hand, no defensive posture meant to intimidate contractors. She stepped out with absolutely nothing on but the raw, exhausted reality of a woman whose sanctuary was collapsing beneath her feet. She looked up at me. I looked down. The blocking was distinct, separated by a sharp edge of coping. Me on the dry, fracturing concrete, her in the water that was slowly destroying it. "The city inspector was here," she said. Her voice didn't echo. It just landed flat against the tiles, lacking the usual sharp cadence she used in our previous phone calls. "I saw the bright orange notice zip-tied to the front gate," I replied, my voice low, keeping the volume strictly controlled. 14 days. Olivia pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose, her fingers visibly tense. "Davis is threatening a full safety shutdown. Eviction from the primary residence if the hillside isn't stabilized. He claims the sheer drop makes the main house a public hazard." She crossed her arms over her chest, not to hide, but to hold herself together physically. "I can't lose this property, Liam. It's the last thing my father built before he died. The deed, the legacy, it's all tied to this foundation." I looked past her, tracking the hairline fracture down the side of the basin again, mentally calculating the thousands of pounds of wet earth pushing against the failing retaining wall. It was a massive job. High liability, tight timeline, terrible access for heavy machinery. The smart play for my firm was to walk away, hand her a bill for the preliminary assessment, and let a massive commercial outfit handle the bureaucratic nightmare. "Come fix this with me," she said. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a plea from a helpless client. It was a request from an equal, offering a paid, time-limited contract that required a specific kind of professional obsession. I set my clipboard down on the patio table. The metal clip made a sharp, definitive clack against the thick glass. You don't need a patch job. You need localized soil stabilization and a helical pier installation drilled straight into the bedrock, I said, shifting my weight, grounding my boots against the hot deck. It's not just fixing a pool. We have to anchor the entire hillside. "I know," she said, stepping entirely up onto the deck. The water pooled around her bare feet, staining the concrete a darker shade of gray. "That's why I hired your firm. I don't need a handyman to slap epoxy on it. I need a structural engineer who doesn't panic when the ground moves." She was shivering. The coastal breeze had picked up, sweeping off the Pacific and cutting through the midday heat. I kept my hands firmly in the pockets of my denim work jeans, gripping the rough fabric lining to keep from reaching out to offer my heavy overshirt. The tension wasn't electric. It was the heavy gravity of restraint. I respected her space entirely too much to crowd her when she was already cornered by the city. I nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. I'll need the original architectural blueprints and the geological survey by tonight. Dig them out of the archives. The next morning at 7 a.m., the theoretical threat of eviction materialized in the physical form of City Inspector Davis. He stood in Olivia's steep driveway, wearing a pristine white hard hat, an aggressively bright yellow vest, and holding a ruggedized tablet. He was flanked by a junior code enforcement officer who looked like he was just learning how to wield a clipboard as a weapon. I was currently wedged under the elevated wooden decking near the pool equipment pad, measuring the sheer stress on the existing steel supports with a set of digital calipers, when I heard Davis's voice boom over the sound of the morning traffic below. "Ms. Johnson, the slope variance is well beyond acceptable municipal margins," Davis was saying, his tone dripping with the kind of bureaucratic satisfaction that came from citing obscure codes. "I'm looking at a 12% grade shift on the lower retaining wall. If I don't see a stamped, certified mitigation plan by the 14th of the month, I am legally obligated to tag the main structure as uninhabitable. You will have to vacate." I wiped a streak of lithium grease from my knuckles onto a red shop rag, methodically cleaning my hands before I climbed up the narrow wooden access ladder. Olivia stood her ground on the stamped concrete driveway, her jaw tight. She had her professional armor firmly back in place today, a crisp, tailored navy blouse and dark slacks. But I could see the slight, rapid tapping of her index finger against the thick stack of manila folders she held against her side. "We are well within the 30-day grace period for an independent structural review," Olivia countered, her voice steady but laced with a thin wire of exhaustion. She held out a document, extending it toward him. "Section 4B of the Municipal Property Code?" "The hillside is actively shifting, ma'am," Davis dismissed, not even bothering to look at the paper she offered. "Grace periods do not apply to imminent hazards. The pool is cracking. The wall is failing. The clock is ticking." I walked over, my heavy boots scuffing against the pavement. I stepped smoothly into the physical space between Davis and Olivia, effectively cutting off his line of sight to her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture aggressively. I just let the absolute certainty of my profession anchor my tone. "The hillside isn't actively shifting today, Davis," I said, pulling my digital inclinometer from the heavy leather pouch on my belt. I held the rectangular aluminum device out so he could see the glowing green screen. "The variance on the primary load-bearing column is exactly 0.04 degrees. The municipal threshold for an imminent catastrophic hazard is 0.15. We are far below an emergency evacuation threshold." Davis blinked, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He adjusted his pristine hard hat. "Who are you?" "Liam Smith, lead structural engineer on this mitigation project," I said, reaching into my shirt pocket and handing him my thick, matte black business card. "License number's on the back. Verify it if you want. The cracking in the pool basin isn't from a full slope failure. It's due to localized hydrostatic pressure from a blocked weep hole behind the secondary retaining wall. I've already cored the concrete this morning. The soil beneath the main footing is compacted at 95%. Davis looked at the card, his eyes scanning the raised lettering. Then he looked at the inclinometer, still resting in my palm, and finally at the orange tag he had clearly intended to slap on the front door. He cleared his throat, his bureaucratic authority suddenly lacking a foundation. "I still require the comprehensive mitigation plan by the 14th, Davis said, stiffly shoving the orange tag back into his vest pocket. "Stamped and certified. No extensions." "You'll have the PDF in your inbox by the 10th, I said, my voice completely flat. Davis turned on his heel and walked back to his city-issued truck, his junior officer scrambling to keep up. I didn't turn to look at Olivia until the white truck pulled out of the driveway and disappeared around the curve of the coastal road. When I finally turned, I saw her shoulders drop exactly 2 inches. The rapid tapping of her finger against the folders had completely stopped. "You didn't have to step in like that," she said quietly, her voice lacking its earlier defensive edge. "I didn't lie to him," I said, picking up my red shop rag again and wiping a speck of dust off my inclinometer before holstering it. "The deep soil is stable, but the water pressure isn't. We have a massive amount of work to do and very little time to do it." We moved the operation inside to her dining room. It was a massive, raw-edge walnut table that currently served as ground zero for our defense strategy. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I unrolled the original architectural blueprints she had pulled from the archives. The paper was heavy, slightly yellowed at the edges, smelling faintly of old cedar and graphite. I weighed the corners down with a tape measure, a coffee mug, and a heavy brass paperweight. "All right," I said, pulling a red drafting pen from behind my ear. "Let's negotiate terms before I put a crew on this property. You need me to bypass the standard 3-month queue for a custom helical pier design?" Olivia sat across from me, her posture perfect, her hands folded neatly on the table. "I need you to prioritize this above your commercial contracts. I know what that costs. I'm prepared to pay the emergency retainer fee." She slid a signed contract across the table. It wasn't a standard homeowner agreement. It was a heavily modified commercial subcontractor agreement, drafted by her, protecting her rights to review every phase of the engineering. She wasn't handing over control. She was hiring an ally. She was negotiating her own deal, setting her own terms without relying on anyone else to speak for her. I read through the clauses quickly. The liability was steep. If my design failed the final audit, I absorbed the cost of the steel. I looked up from the paper, meeting her eyes. They were sharp, intelligent, and completely exhausted. "These terms are aggressive," I noted, my tone neutral. "I'm fighting for my home, Liam," she said simply. "I don't have the luxury of being passive." I respected that more than I could articulate. I clicked my pen, signed the bottom line with a swift, fluid motion, and pushed the carbon copy back toward her. "We start excavation tomorrow at 6 a.m., I said, immediately pulling out a fresh legal pad. I began mapping a step-by-step plan. Phase 1, soil removal and pressure relief. Phase 2, drill the guide holes for the piers. Phase 3, pour the new footings. I'm building a contingency of 2 days for bad weather. We hit the deadline by the 10th, giving us 4 days of buffer before Davis returns. Over the next 4 days, the polite professional distance between us was entirely stripped away by the brutal reality of physical labor. I was at the house from sunrise to sunset, running ground-penetrating radar, checking soil density, and personally operating the mini excavator to dig the relief trenches alongside the pool wall. Olivia didn't retreat into her air-conditioned office to hide from the noise. She stayed out in the punishing heat with me. She managed the logistics, coordinated with the concrete dispatchers, and organized the permits, her phone constantly pressed to her ear. On Tuesday afternoon, the coastal humidity settled over the property like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I was down in the 4-foot trench we'd excavated, fighting a seized cast-iron flange on the main subterranean pressure valve. The metal was heavily corroded, fused together by years of salt air and moisture. My heavy wrench slipped off the bolt, barking my knuckles hard against the rusted iron pipe. I let out a sharp, frustrated exhale through my teeth, dropping my head back against the dirt wall of the trench. My muscles ached with a dull, persistent throb. I wiped the stinging sweat from my forehead using the back of my forearm, leaving a smear of dark topsoil across my skin. "Hand me the cheater bar," I called out, not looking up, my voice rough from dust and thirst. A shadow fell over the edge of the trench, blocking the harsh sun. Olivia crouched at the edge, holding the heavy, hollow steel pipe extension. She didn't just toss it down to me like a laborer would. She reached down, her arm extending into the trench, and waited until my leather-gloved hand had a firm, secure grip on the metal before she finally let go. "You've been down in that hole for 4 straight hours," she observed, her voice quiet, lacking any judgment. "The main valve needs to be entirely bypassed before we can safely pour the new footings tomorrow morning," I said, fitting the hollow cheater bar over the handle of my wrench to gain mechanical leverage. I braced my boots against the opposite dirt wall and threw my entire body weight against the steel. The corroded metal groaned in protest, a terrible screeching sound, and then finally gave way with a sharp, echoing crack. I climbed out of the trench, moving slowly, covered in a thick layer of dirt, sweat, and rust. I pulled off my heavy leather gloves, slapping them against my thigh to knock off the loose soil. Olivia was standing by the patio table. She had a cold bottle of water waiting. She didn't make a big theatrical production of it. She just pushed the plastic bottle across the smooth glass surface toward me, exactly to the edge where I stood. "Thanks," I said, my voice quiet. I unscrewed the cap. The heavy condensation instantly cooled the heat radiating from my palm. "I reviewed your updated CAD files for the helical piers last night," she said, leaning her hip against the edge of the table, her arms crossed. "You over-engineered the shear load capacity by 30% above the city requirement." "I don't like cutting structural integrity close," I replied, taking a long drink. "It costs significantly more in raw steel," she pointed out. "It sleeps better at night," I answered simply. She looked at me, really looked at me, her gaze steady and analytical. The silence stretched out between us, filled only by the low mechanical hum of the temporary water pump trying to keep the trench dry. "My dad used to say that exact phrase," she murmured, looking away, her eyes tracing the roofline of the house. "He built this place with his own hands. He always said a house is only ever as good as what you can't see." "He was an intelligent man," I said. "The foundation is everything. The finishes are just paint." I kept my physical distance. I stayed firmly on my side of the patio table. The urge to reach out, to just brush the light dusting of concrete powder off her shoulder, was a constant, low-level static humming in the back of my mind. I ignored it completely. I kept my hands wrapped around the cold water bottle. The tension wasn't built on anything frantic. It was built on the sheer discipline of maintaining a professional boundary because her safety and her home were more important than my impulses. I packed up my heavy tools, making absolutely sure the trench was safely secured with caution tape for the night. The midpoint of the project hit us on Thursday evening, arriving with the subtlety of a collapsing roof. It was 6 p.m. We were sitting at her dining room table again, the blueprints spread out under the warm, yellow glow of the pendant lights. The house was quiet. The heavy machinery finally shut down for the day. I was calculating the final cubic yardage for the concrete order. Her phone buzzed violently against the hard wood of the table. Olivia glanced at the screen, and the color drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and rigid. She picked the phone up, her eyes scanning a newly arrived email. Her breathing went shallow, her chest barely moving. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady, an anchor against whatever panic was hitting her. "It's the bank," she said, her voice sounding hollow, as if the air had been pulled from her lungs. "The city. Davis must have filed a preliminary hazard notice on the property title today." The bank's automated system flagged it. They just pulled the construction line of credit. They're freezing the funds until the hazard is cleared. The silence in the room became absolute, heavy and suffocating. Without the active credit line, we couldn't purchase the specialized steel for the piers. Without the piers, the city would condemn the house on the 14th. It was a perfect, inescapable, bureaucratic chokehold. Olivia dropped the phone onto the blueprints. She pressed the heels of her hands hard against her eyes, taking a sharp, shaky breath. "I'm going to lose it. I can't fund the steel order out of pocket by tomorrow. I'm going to lose all of it." I didn't offer a useless platitude. I didn't reach across the table to pat her hand and tell her it was going to magically be okay. I pulled my heavy laptop toward me, opened the screen, and booted up my project management and accounting software. "How much do we need for the steel delivery to hit the site by 7 a.m. tomorrow?" I asked, my fingers already moving across the keyboard. She lowered her hands, blinking at me in confusion. $22,000. Liam, you can't— "I'm not writing a personal check," I said, typing rapidly, accessing my commercial vendor portals. "I'm rerouting the supply chain. I have a massive corporate account with a commercial fabricator down in San Diego, net 60 payment terms. I'll order the steel under my firm's name and leverage my own credit rating. We install it, get the city to clear the hazard notice on the 10th, and the bank unfreezes your credit line long before my invoice is ever due." She stared at me, her eyes wide. "If the city delays the sign-off, or if Davis finds one tiny flaw to reject the permit, you are personally on the hook for $22,000. It could tank your firm's quarterly operating budget." "Then I guess I better make absolutely sure the engineering is flawless," I said, hitting the enter key with a definitive tap. The order confirmation pinged loudly on my screen, a green checkmark appearing. I closed the laptop lid. I pulled my paper schedule toward me, picked up my pen, and wrote her name across the entire next week in heavy black ink, blocking out every other client. I treated the ink on the paper like a sworn commitment. Olivia looked at the closed silver lid of the laptop, then down at the schedule where her name was written, and finally up at my face. "Why are you taking this kind of risk for me?" "Because the wall can be fixed," I said simply, holding her gaze. "And because you shouldn't have to lose your home over a systemic paperwork delay." She let out a long, shaky exhale. The tension in the room suddenly shifted, turning incredibly heavy, grounding us both. She reached slowly across the table. I didn't pull away. She laid her hand flat over mine, resting atop the schedule. Her skin was warm, her fingers slightly trembling from the adrenaline crash. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a pure transfer of stability. The chaotic noise of the bank, the city, and the debt was physically blocked out by the quiet stillness of the room. Her panic flowed outward, hitting the solid wall of my calm, and the tremor in her hand finally stopped as she gripped mine. "Thank you," she whispered. "We start pouring the first round of concrete at 5 a.m., I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I gently, respectfully slid my hand out from under hers, picking up my truck keys from the table. I needed to leave the room before I did something reckless like promise her I would fight the entire city council myself. I gave her space without disappearing, promising to be back before the sun rose. The final week was a brutal, relentless marathon of physical labor and absolute precision timing. We installed the heavy helical piers on Saturday, fighting through a sudden, unexpected coastal rainstorm that turned the trench into a muddy nightmare. The rain added thousands of pounds of hydrostatic pressure to the failing wall. I spent 14 straight hours covered in freezing mud and hydraulic fluid, running the excavator in the downpour, perfectly aligning the steel shafts and driving them deep into the bedrock. I handled the dangerous, shifting environment with calm expertise, refusing to let the weather compromise the structural integrity of the installation. Olivia stood under a heavy tarp, shining a high-lumen floodlight exactly where I needed it, never once complaining about the cold or the mud. We worked in silent synchronization. By the time Friday arrived, the 10th, the day of the final city audit, the site was immaculate. The deep trench was fully backfilled with compacted gravel. The new concrete footings were cured and solid. The pool water was glassy and perfectly still, reflecting the morning sun. The air smelled of clean ozone and damp earth. Inspector Davis arrived at exactly 9 a.m. He did not look smug today. He looked determined to find a flaw. He spent 2 agonizing hours reviewing the structural logs, checking the pier depths against my engineering stamps, and running his own digital laser level across the entire span of the concrete deck. Olivia and I stood by the patio table. I was in a clean, dry work shirt. She was in a sharp, tailored blazer. We didn't speak. I stood slightly in front of her, physically absorbing the tension of the weight, keeping my posture relaxed to project absolute confidence in the work. Finally, Davis walked over. He looked at the data on his tablet, then at me. The soil compaction tests came back at 98%, Davis said, his tone entirely devoid of its previous arrogance, replaced by grudging professional respect. The steel anchors exceed municipal code requirements by a significant margin. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a thick, bright green clearance sticker and slapped it firmly onto the electrical box near the pool equipment. The hazard notice is officially lifted, Davis said, signing off on the digital permit on his tablet. Good work, Smith. You saved the property. He walked away. The sound of his heavy truck pulling out of the driveway was the loudest, most beautiful sound in the world. Olivia didn't cheer. She didn't jump up and down. She just took her thick glasses off, folded the arms carefully, and set them gently on the glass table. The relief that washed over her was a visible, physical thing, unknotting years of deeply held stress and fear. "It's done," she said quietly, staring at the green sticker. "It's done," I confirmed. I pulled the final clearance document from my clipboard, signed my name to certify the completion, and slid the paper across the table to her. She picked up my pen and signed her name right next to mine, committing to the finalized plan in black ink. I started packing up my blueprints, rolling the thick paper into a tight, neat cylinder. "I'll send the final invoice and the clearance paperwork to the bank on Monday morning. Your credit line will be fully restored by noon." I turned, lifting my heavy tool bag, preparing to walk toward my truck. The job was over. The boundary of the contract was met. "Liam." I stopped. I set the tool bag down on the concrete. I looked back. Olivia picked up the rolled blueprint from the table. She held it for a second, then set it firmly back down. Then, in the bright, unforgiving light of the coastal afternoon, she stepped directly into my space. She didn't say a single word. She just reached up, wrapped her arms firmly around my shoulders, and pulled herself against me. I froze for a fraction of a second. The sudden silence that settled over me was absolute. The chaos of the week, the debt, the rain, the fear, it was all physically blocked out by her presence. I let go of the rigid, disciplined control I'd maintained for the last 8 weeks. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her in, burying my face against her shoulder. It was the feeling of a heavy steel door locking permanently into place. Absolute, undeniable shelter. We stood there in the quiet aftermath, holding on to each other until the residual adrenaline completely faded from our systems, leaving nothing but steady, quiet reality. She stepped back slightly, keeping her hands resting on my chest, looking up into my eyes. "You didn't just fix a retaining wall," she said, her voice completely steady. "I just did the job I was hired to do," I said quietly. She shook her head, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "No, you stayed. When it got hard, you stayed." I reached out, finally allowing myself to touch her face. I tucked a stray piece of blonde hair behind her ear, my thumb resting gently against her jawline. I leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't frantic, and it wasn't a desperate exploration. It was a destination. It felt heavy, grounding, and absolute. A promise sealed without needing to say a single word. It was the feeling of finally coming home. "I'm not going anywhere," I said against her forehead. "The foundation is solid." Looking back now, I realize that love isn't about holding on tight to control a situation. It's about building a foundation so strong that you know they will stay even when you let go. Real healthy love looks different from toxic passion. It isn't about dramatic rescue missions. It's about consistency, safety, and showing up to do the work day after day until the ground beneath you stops shaking. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.